folks. Welcome to Our City Matters. Today is the third Monday that we're taping of the month, and every third Monday we are going to have Evan Sorensen with us, who is the founder of New England Institute for Marriage and Family Therapy from Bedford, New Hampshire. So I appreciate you being with us,
Thank
Evan.
you. Yep, glad to be back.
The second topic this year that we're doing is chronic conflict or conflict in marriage and families.
Yep.
That's a pretty intense topic, I think.
It's a common topic. I guess if we, I guess the way I would look at it is if we're going to call it chronic conflict, it's probably more a result of people have bad habits in terms of how they process disagreements, how they talk about things. And so it just means that they have lots of bad results frequently. So the conflict is kind of chronic and frequent and not very effective.
So families kind of get themselves in a cycle of not being able to have effective resolutions of issues.
Yep. Bad habits produce bad results.
Okay, so you have some strategies for us today and some insights.
Well, what I thought would be good is because what we know as an industry in terms of the field of psychology, we know that when we're trying to change behavior habits or relationship dynamics, we know that there needs to be a lot of practice and a lot of repetition of the skills that we're trying to develop. So I thought what would be good is just to do a quick review of 2 or 3 points from our last session last month, but really just to drive this idea home that behavior change requires repetition, and repetition.
Good repetition.
And repetition. Lots of practice. And
practice for the better.
Yeah, and there's no shortcut around that. And that's one of the things that I'm often trying to tell couples is that listen, that there's no quick remedies. It's a lot of hard work. So
ineffective communication is basically a bad habit.
Yeah, very much a bad habit. So there were 3 things that we mentioned last time that would be good to review. Now, one was the idea about viewing therapy as from a stance of being proactive. So proactive care versus reactive care, viewing marriage counseling or family counseling as a first line of defense, not as a last resort. And a lot of that comes out of the research that tells us that couples often come into counseling or families come into counseling 6 years after they've identified or that they know they have problems. And so we have this kind of reactive approach within the therapy field. And so that would be number one, is to really encourage people to get care quickly and get it early rather than late. The other piece that we talked about was this idea about open communication, that couples check in with one another on a regular basis. And we talked about this idea about developing what we call a ritual connection, and that is a unique way that couples spend time with one another more days than not each week. A couple of the common examples of that would be, a couple that has coffee together before they leave in the morning for work, or they come home at the end of the day and they share a glass of wine or tea, or they cook together, or they have a bowl of ice cream or popcorn on the couch together before they wrap up their day. But they have this habit of connecting with one another on a regular basis.
In a positive way. Yes.
Yep, and they talk about their day and what's been going on. And sometimes, because they're spending time with one another, they just talk about the logistics, what's coming up the next day or what their day was like. Sometimes, because they've created that space and time for one another, they talk about more meaningful and important issues in their lives, dreams, goals, where they're heading, things along those lines. So, and then the last one was this idea about keeping it fun and adventurous. We know that couples that are doing well often have a bit of spontaneity and creativity in the relationship. They don't just settle into the same routine of going to the same restaurant and having the same meal all the time. They carve in new and exciting ways of spending time with one another. And I mentioned a couple things. One was you could do a Google search of 50 pleasurable activities, and you'll find a list of all kinds of new and interesting ideas about how to spend a date night. You could look through the local paper or the Hippo and see what's coming up for activities and festivals and things like that. But try to keep it fresh and exciting and adventurous.
It takes a little effort.
It takes a lot of effort,
and
it's but keep it fun and not stale. So those were a few of the things that we talked about. We talked about last time, and I think it's important for repetition's sake that people hear that again.
That's good.
So, Yeah.
So now we're on to how to resolve or how to be in a good place with handling conflicts.
Yeah, yeah. I guess what I would say is that, disagreements are common with all couples. Sometimes people have this idea that, the happy marriages have very few conflict, or they don't have disappointments or hurts or things along those lines. And the research just really doesn't support that at all. We know that even the couples that rate as being very happy have disappointments and hurts just like everybody else. The difference is that they handle those moments very differently than the couples that or the families that are struggling. And so we'll talk a little bit about today about maybe 3 or 4 strategies that couples can use when they're having a disagreement that I think will produce better outcomes and results for them. But we want to make sure that people understand that conflict, disappointment, stepping on each other's toes, that's part of any committed relationship. That's normal. That doesn't mean that there's anything severely wrong with you. But we do know that if we can get them the right tools, they will have more positive outcomes. So a question I might ask you is, what percentage of couples that say that they're in a happy marriage, what percentage of their problems or their conflicts would you say they would call solvable? So of the happiest married couples, what percentage of their problems are solvable? Would they say we've solved that?
Well, they probably solve most of their problems.
Give me a number.
90%?
Wow. That's fantastic. It's actually, you're going to be surprised by this then. Even the happiest married couples say that only 31% of their problems are actually totally solved.
Wow. So
Okay.
they're dealing with a lot of stuff still.
Well, yeah, the difference, though, is that the way they talk about it and the way they deal with it doesn't result in the relationship kind of falling apart. Again, these are couples that are saying that they're very happy
Wow.
in their marriage, yet 69% of their problems remain unsolved. That means they kind of keep running into the same roadblocks again and again. This guy who I mention a lot of, John Gottman, has just really done fascinating research, and one of the things he does is what they call these longitudinal studies, and that is they follow couples for years. They have them come into the studio or the office over a period of 10 years, let's say. And every 2 or 3 years they have them come back in and they do a follow-up interview to see how they're doing. And what he's fascinated by is that when they come in and they videotape them having a conflict around a problem in year number 1, when they come back in year number 3 and year number 5 and year number 7 and they videotape them again having a problem, they're always talking about the same thing, right? So the problems themselves aren't solvable all the time. But the way they talk about them are more effective. And so that's really what we'll talk a little bit about today as well. So what are those couples that are saying that they're happy? What are they doing compared to the couples that are saying that they're struggling? So again, we want to debunk this idea that happy married couples 90% of the
problems.
time, maybe you're the exception to the rule, but it's nowhere near 90% for
Oh
the
my.
happiest. It's much, much lower than that. So I think
So we
that's
all
really-
have problems, but we're all trying to figure out how to deal with them.
Well, another way that we could put it is we could say it's the issue, meaning the problem that people or the conflict that people are having. The issue is not the issue. It's how we talk about the issue that is the issue. Does that make sense? The issue itself is not the issue. No, people are having issues. That's not the issue. Again, it's how they talk about that problem or that issue. That's the issue.
Okay.
And so that's a little bit maybe of what we'll talk about today.
Okay,
But-
great, because, some people blame each other, correct? I mean, you're my issue.
Yep.
And it's really
Uh-oh.
not that other person, it's
Correct.
how we're trying to deal with an issue.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit today about a few things. One is what we call the importance of taking a time out. We'll talk a little bit about what we call softened startup, which means, if I've got a complaint or a frustration, how do I start that conversation? The backside of that coin, we'll talk a little bit about when my partner shares a frustration or a complaint with me, how do I listen in a way that's actually productive, so what we call softened response. And then finally, we'll talk about the importance of what we would call repair attempts. And that's going to be one of the things that we see differentiate the couples that are struggling versus those that are doing well, is the ability to make a repair after there's been that inevitable disagreement.
Okay.
So the first area around taking the break, I guess there's a little bit of science. Everybody's heard about this idea about taking a time out. What I want to talk to you about a little bit in the beginning is the science behind taking the time out, like why we need to take that time out. And there's this fascinating little research that basically says, the brain is divided up into different regions or areas. And the prefrontal cortex, this part in the front of your brain, is responsible for things like objectivity, reason, logic, to some degree kind of empathy, being able to see things for what they are, not just in an emotionally charged kind of way. Very important part of the brain. You can imagine if you're having a disagreement, the ability to kind of look at things objectively, use a little bit of logic and reason to kind of talk things out. Empathy, my ability to kind of imagine how you feel or try to see it from your perspective. That part of the brain is really, really critical. But guess what happens when people are intensifying their conflict, meaning they're getting more and more flooded or more and more intense? What ends up happening is that there is a stress hormone that gets released in the body, and that stress hormone is called cortisol. And when your heart rate gets to, if you're an active person, an athlete, 80 beats a minute or higher, or like the rest of us that aren't super athletic, once you get to 100 beats per minute or higher, cortisol floods the system. And what cortisol does is it causes that part of the brain, the front part of the brain, to shut down and go offline. So again, logic, reason, empathy, objectivity, all of that stuff goes offline. And what comes online is a very old part of our brain that's centered around kind of protection. It's about taking charge. It's about perceiving threats and what does the brain do when it's perceiving threats. And it moves into this old thing that most of us have heard about, which is what we call fight or flight, or fight, flight, or freeze.
Defenses.
Yes, very strong defenses. It's geared towards self-protection and preservation, versus the front part of the brain, again, is geared towards something different. It's about cooperation and compromise. And so I'm often telling people, you can't walk around with one of these heart rate monitors that tells you whether you're at 80 beats a minute or 100 beats a minute. So I often encourage them to think about it this way. Think about a 10-point scale. If you're at a 1, you're very calm and very relaxed. If you're at a 10, you're extremely agitated and upset, kind of ready to go through the roof type of a thing. You've just had it. And once a person gets to about a 6 or certainly a 7 or above, we can pretty safely assume that they are what we call flooded, and that heart rate is up, and the body is flooded with cortisol. And again, when the body gets flooded with cortisol, the parts of you that you need to have an effective conversation shut down. What comes online is high emotionality, high reactivity, and that's when people end up, because they're in that fight or flight mode, they end up saying things or doing things that make the problem worse.
So we need to try to stay calm.
We need to, we can talk a little bit about self-soothing, but really at this stage of the game and early on in therapy, we often want people to just become more mindful of where am I on that scale right now, and to make a covenant, an agreement with one another that says, listen, we know the science. The science is very straightforward. If either one of us is at a 7 or above, we cannot, no matter how hard we try, we cannot have an effective conversation. So let's make a covenant, an agreement with one another that says if either one of us ever says we're flooded or at a 7 or above, that we agree to take a break because we cannot talk productively. And then there's a few pieces about the break that are very important, and I'll tell you about those in a sec. But whenever I share this piece with couples, immediately they always start to tell me, well, that's why we've been getting it wrong all along. We've been in a disagreement, it's getting more and more intense and higher and higher and higher, and we just keep going at it, right? And so they have very bad outcomes. That's why I was saying earlier that the problems are often a result of bad habits, not chemistry or compatibility. When we stay in the conversation when we're flooded, we're going to have bad outcomes.
So that's a tool that our folks at home can can implement.
Yeah, yeah.
Just right off and just say, okay, we won't go there, and we're going to take a rest,
Yep.
and we'll revisit the conversation later.
Correct.
Okay.
And so there are a couple other pieces I would say to this idea about taking a break. One would be find a way for you and your spouse to have, sometimes people have cue words, a word or a phrase that they use for one another that signals, hey, I'm flooded. I've heard some very funny things like Zynga or Rosebud or something along those lines. Sometimes they come up with a funny word that helps remind them that I'm flooded. Sometimes they just say, I've reached my maximum, I need to take a break. But they're very clear in communicating that I need to take a break right now. Consider a person that's had some struggles growing up and they have abandonment issues or something along those lines, and their partner, instead of saying, hey, Deborah, I'm at my threshold, I need to take a break, they just, instead of saying that, they just walk out the door or they leave.
Slam
For a person
the door.
that's had a lot of loss or abandonment in their life, that could be very uncomfortable, kind of a scary process that, we're not getting along, and then you take off. And so we've learned that it's very important that if you take the breaks, you have to be very specific about saying, I'm taking a break right now. Then you do a couple other important things. If you say, I need to take a break, secondly, you make a comment about when you will come back to it. We're not in the business of sweeping things under the carpet, which a lot of couples do. They have the blowout or the disagreement, but then they never really talk about it, and they just sweep it under the carpet. They think that time heals all wounds. It actually doesn't. It just adds to the backlog of unresolved issues. So the person says, I need to take a break, and then they make a comment about when they will come back.
Oh, okay.
Now, that could be different for different situations. It could be, I'm going to go out and run the groceries. When I come back, we'll talk about this again. Or it could be, I've got to go to work. When I come home tonight, we'll talk about it. It could be, I just need 10 or 15 minutes or 20 minutes to calm down. Let's, take a break and come back in 20 minutes. But they make a statement about when they're going to come back. And then they do a third very important thing, which is when they take the break, they do something that helps them relax. And the reason why we want them, again, to relax is because we got to get that heart rate to come down. We got to get the cortisol levels to go down. And so that part of the brain, object, reason, empathy, logic, all of that starts to come back online. So when we have a conversation, I'm in a better frame of mind to actually listen to what you're saying and deliver what I have to say in a way that's actually effective. So they take at least 20 minutes and they do something that's relaxing. And what do you do that's relaxing? If you want to do something to take a break and relax, what's something you might do?
Go knit a few rows on my knitting project.
I wouldn't know how to do that, but that's unique to you.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that helps you feel relaxed.
We have 10 minutes left.
Oh, that's it?
So we need to just go on to the next, I think.
Okay.
But we're on a good roll here.
Okay. So, all right. So they take the break. They identify it. They come back to it. Another thing that couples do that that differentiates them from the couples that are struggling is that when they have an issue to bring up, they start with what we call softened startup. They avoid a harsh startup. A harsh startup is something that might start with criticism. It's when I'm upset, I say things about you and your character that are kind of derogatory and painful. And when I do that, what we figured out from the research is if I lead with criticism, that I will 90% of the time get a defensive response back from you. So that doesn't work. Criticism doesn't work. What does work is soften startup. And what we want people to do is to be able to complain. We want them to be able to talk about what's frustrating them, but we don't want them to add the blame component to it. So there's a few pieces that are very important. Whatever I say or do is polite. It's courteous. I talk about I statements versus you statements. We mentioned that last time. I search for and make comments about stuff that I appreciate or that's positive within you or about the situation. And I ask for what I need, but in a gentler kind of way. So let me give you an example of how to do it wrong and a quick example of how to do it right. How to do it wrong. Let's say that I'm a neat Nick. I like to keep the house organized, which isn't the case, by the way. But let's say that I am that way, and you're kind of less organized, and you like to put your clothes on the floor next to the bed when you come home from work, and you leave them there, and a pile develops. A harsh startup would be coming up to you and saying something like, you're very disorganized. It's rude what you're doing to me. It's you're a pig. You don't take care of things. You just you live in filth and squalor. What's wrong with you? I can't believe you'd actually do this. I mean, didn't your mother raise you to be better than this? This is ridiculous. I've been asking you to do this for years, and you can't do it. I mean, are you hard of hearing? I just don't get it. Okay? That's a harsh startup. And quite frankly, a lot of people do it that way. A softened startup might be something like, hey, listen, I know we've talked about this before, but I spend a lot of time trying to keep the house organized. That's something that's important to me. And when I come into our bedroom and I see your pile of clothes there by the bed, sometimes it makes me feel like like you're disrespecting me almost, or you don't really that what matters to me isn't important to you. And I know you work hard just like I do, and I know that there's a lot of really great things you do, but this piece really, really bothers me. And I'm wondering if there's a way for us to kind of find a solution to that.
Together,
right? Now, how you feel when I deliver it the second way, I'm sure is very different than how you feel when I deliver it the first way.
Less defensive.
Yeah. So softened startup is what helps the conversation move forward. If I lead with softened startup, it's more likely that I'll get your participation in it. If I lead with criticism, I'll get your resistance. Okay? Now, what about when the partner hears, so we've just talked about softened startup, but let's say I'm the one receiving the message. Now, how do I respond in a way that's actually going to make this conversation move forward? And that's what we call softened response. Softened response is the opposite of defensiveness. We'll talk later about all this wonderful research of Gottman in terms of defensiveness is one of the 4 elements of communication that almost always destroy conversations. So defensiveness doesn't work. The antidote to defensiveness is taking ownership or responsibility for my contribution to the problem. And so when I respond, I do a couple really important things. I reflect back the content. I say something that either paraphrases or almost I can do it verbatim, but I reflect back what you've said to me to make sure that you feel that I'm listening to you. I lean towards you. We have good eye contact, things along those lines. But I reflect back the content, and then I listen for, is there a kernel of truth to what you're saying? Right? Is there some element of your perspective that I know has merit, that has some validity to it? And if it does, I acknowledge it.
You're validating that
I validate it. So if I was the husband in the example I used earlier, I might say something like, yeah, I can hear what you're saying. It sounds like you're really frustrated because you spend a lot of time keeping the house organized, and when you come in the bedroom and you see my pile of clothes, it feels like I'm not, very respectful of you. And I know I agreed that I would do a better job of that, and I haven't. And so I own that. I'm sorry. Now, I might say we're kind of different in that way, so I might not get it right every time, but I hear what you're saying. It makes sense to me. I said I would do something, and I didn't. I'll work on that.
Work on that, right.
That's the opposite of defensiveness. Now, a lot of times, your partner will bring something to your attention that has merit. They got you on something, but we have the pride or the ego gets in the way, and we have a hard time acknowledging it. What the masters of relationships do is they own responsibility for the piece that they've contributed to it. They say, I'm sorry.
5 minutes.
Okay.
You have so much to say and so much
I do.
good things, and I'm sorry we have to stick to our time.
Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, the other thing then I guess I would say, well, gosh, you're right. There's so much to talk about. Can I just use one quick thing? It's a prop. The prop is that sometimes when people are having the conversation like we did, that when I'm the listener, I will oftentimes I want to interrupt, or I'll make an excuse, or I'll rationalize, or some people are good at turning the tables. You say something about me, and then I'll say, well, what about when you didn't cook the dinner last night?
Tit for tat, yeah.
That doesn't work. And so our natural human tendency is when we feel like somebody is calling us out, it's to make a rebuttal. What some people have figured out helps them stay in the listener role where they're reflecting back the content and they're taking ownership for their piece of the puzzle is if they hold on to something, like a pen or a tissue box or something along those lines, but they hold on to an object that reminds them, my job here is just to listen. And I'm going to reflect back the content, and I'm going to validate. When I don't hold on to something, my human tendency takes over, and I tend to interrupt and cut off and things along those lines. So, so that's a little strategy that might be helpful for couples. Now, the last piece I guess I will mention to you is the importance of what we call a repair attempt. So, as I said earlier, even the best relationships have lots of miscommunication. People are stepping on each other's toes, hurting one another's feelings. The difference, one of the key differences between couples that are doing well versus those that are struggling, is the couples that are doing well have this thing to come back and make a repair. A repair simply means it's an attempt on my part to fix what happened. That means I sometimes apologize. Sometimes it means I come back after the fact and I say, that didn't go well. Let's try it again. Sometimes it means I come back and say, I didn't see it then, but I think I understand where you're coming from now. Let's try it again. With the close example, it could be the guy coming back and saying, like I said earlier, which is, this idea about, I know I agreed to do that and I didn't. I apologize for that. I don't know why it's so difficult, but a lot of people struggle to say, I'm sorry and I apologize. And we know without any question that that is one of the key ingredients that makes relationships work, the ability to come back and make a repair. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to step on each other's toes.
Sincere apologies, because sometimes people think, yeah, you're always saying you're sorry, but we really don't really get over what we're trying to accomplish. Saying sorry doesn't cut it,
Yeah. So I would say, two things. Get that word repair attempt burned into your brain. Two, when your partner makes an attempt at repair, recognize it. Recognize their attempt to come back and say, I'm sorry. And when they recognize it, when I recognize my partner's doing that, accept it. So not only recognize that my partner is making an attempt, but accept their attempt.
You got to accept apologies.
Or start the repair attempt myself. Even if I feel like I'm the one who was wrong, I can still come back and say, I don't like the distance that's there between us. Let's try to talk that out again. That's an attempt to make a repair. So
no silent treatment.
No, that doesn't work. That's the opposite of a repair attempt.
Right.
No sweeping under the carpet, no silent treatment. We need to get people to communicate and talk about what's going on. But we know the structure of what makes those conversations work better.
And should couples talk about these intense communication in front of their children?
No, absolutely not. I would just look at it this way. I would say that as parents, we are models to our children. So what we demonstrate to them is what they're going to, that's going to affect or determine their conflict style. So if we flood, like I said earlier, and start becoming critical and defensive, and our kids are seeing that, we're teaching them that same style. So, so no, that's not very effective.
Okay, well, we covered quite a bit in a half hour, and we're going to protect the children and not argue in front of them.
Yep.
And not give them bad habits or examples of bad habits.
Yeah, and if we're going to have disagreements, if we follow the format, like I've talked about today, that's great modeling for them.
All right, Evan. I appreciate you being here.
You're welcome.
That was a great coverage on resolving conflict, and we'll see you next month on life transitions.
All right.
I thank you so much. We'll see you
very
next
welcome.
time on Our City Matters. Take care.
Thank you.